Okay, this is going to be our last section on Beloved, and I just want to hit a few things in that second to the last chapter when Paul D returns to find Setha. She is laying in the bed where baby Suggs went to die, and Paul D comes in, and she says to him, I made the ink, Paul D. He couldn't have done it if I hadn't made the ink. And that's our first thought. And we've been told that she made ink for school teacher, the ink that he used to take his notes. And he liked the way that she made it. And she'd always been proud of that. It was her recipe, I guess Mrs. Garner's recipe. But he liked the way that she made it. He couldn't have taken those notes. They couldn't have written down her human characteristics and her animal characteristics if she hadn't made the ink. And that was the catalyst for getting out and then ultimately for killing her child. And then she says, she left me, Paul D. She was my best thing. The thing about her children for her was her children were clean. Her children weren't, so in several places it talks about how they could dirty you. Slaveholders could change the way you think about yourself. And over they refer to that as, they could dirty you. They could take what was pure and good in a person and make it ugly and make Paul D question his manhood. Or the ways that it dirtied baby Suggs, having to have 8 children with 7 different fathers, which we've talked about, when we read Harriet Jacobs, the way that the discourse, the cultural idea was chastity and purity, but that was denied slaves. So even though they didn't have a choice, they also constantly got these messages about being promiscuous, right? So her children had been clean, and she wanted to keep them clean, pure. And so because they had been pure, she said, she left me, Paul D. She was my best thing. And Paul D thinks about 6-0 and how he used to talk about the 30-mile woman. And he would say, she's a friend of my mind. She gathered me. The pieces that I am, she gathered them together and give them all back in the right order. It's good, when you've got a woman who's a friend of your mind. Paul D thinks, there were so many things to think about this woman. He wants to lay his story next to hers. And he says, Setha, you and me got more yesterday than anybody. We need some kind of tomorrow. If you remember when they went to the carnival early on, it occurs to Setha that maybe we could have a life. And that's what he's saying. We need to have some kind of tomorrow. And then he says, there's a line there that is one of my favorite lines, because I like the way that it's written. And Paul D takes her hand, but Morrison says his holding fingers were holding hers. And he says, you're your best thing, Setha. You are. And she says, me? And then we go to the last chapter, which says 3 different times, this was not a story to pass on. This is a very sort of poetic chapter. And it says it was not a story to pass on, so they forgot her. And this is beloved slipping away, slipping out of their memories, because it was not a story to pass on. How do you tell this story? So they forgot her. And that last chapter is Morrison, sort of a comment on how we collectively, in our collective memory, collective history, slavery has not been a story, is a story not to pass on. It's too horrible. How do you ever make the horror of the experience clear to people who didn't endure it when all you have, the only tool you have, is language? Language is so inadequate. How do you communicate the experience? No one, we've talked about this, no one wants to tell and no one wants to hear. So we forget it. But the last word of the novel is beloved. So this story that was not a story to pass on is a story that remains beloved. Okay, so that's it. Hope you liked it. I hope it gives some perspective. I think right now it's easy to think this is the hardest thing we have ever dealt with in our lives, being cooped up in our homes for week upon week. But hopefully this novel gives us a little perspective. The human nature is so resilient, and people overcome things they should never have to. It's one of the things that interests me most in literature, is how people write about experiences that are too horrible to ever even conceive of if you didn't experience them, and how they use language to make that experience present for those of us who haven't had to endure it. And I think this novel does that so well. And we remember that there have been strong and resilient people who have endured traumas beyond our imagining and come through it. Maybe not unscathed, certainly scarred, but they endure. So maybe this gives us a little bit of perspective. Okay, we're done.